Today, we become legends.
While many of Smite's items are what I would call main build items that just work, provide good stats and a universal effect that you always want, for example CDR or bonus crit damage, etc., but there are quite a few of Smite's items that aren't so simple and can't just be shoved into any build to great success. These situational counter-build items can be a huge part of winning or losing a game, as they are insane in some scenarios but trash in others. So this video will discuss every single situational item in Smite and when to build them, so let's jump in. First up, we have the Anti-Auto Attack items, consisting of Midgardian Mail, Bewitched Dagger, Spectral Armor, and the Thorns Relic. For Midgardian and Witchblade Dagger, I would personally consider building these items in two scenarios. Firstly, if one auto attacker on the enemy team is causing huge problems and or is very fed, I will consider grabbing these and targeting that enemy to shut them down in teamfights. The second scenario is the more obvious and more common one. If the enemy has two or more strong auto attackers like Hunter and Kali, or Merc Jungle, or Freya plus Hunter in mid, etc. In this situation, I would say you definitely should be building at least one of these, with Midgardian typically being more for solo laners who like to get in the enemy's face and take a bunch of their autos while doing so, and Bewitched Dagger being more of a support item as they like the relic cooldown reduction for their strong teamfight relics, and it applies in an aura which doesn't require you to be constantly in someone's face tanking all of their hits to get the value. If an enemy goes on your backline, just standing near them while you have this item will help and give good value. Spectral Armor is a slightly different case in my opinion, as I think this item is worth building even if the enemy has just one crit user. A 40% reduction to their crit damage along with decent base stats and free power every time you get crit is just good enough even against one crit user. Against more than one, of course this item is essential and you're trolling if you don't build it, and at that point you might even want both your support and solo to have it so that you can provide the aura to backliners and frontliners simultaneously, but of course auras like this don't stack with each other. Usually the support will pick this item up more than the solo as the aura gets more value that way, but solos can also pick this up to help them dive and help to give their jungler that anti-crit as well when they're diving. Definitely worth a pickup against a high crit build from the enemy team. And finally, Thorns hasn't seen a lot of play in quite a while, even in the peak of double hunter meta with Matikaras dominating in mid, so I don't really think the item is that good at the moment, but it does exist if you think having one or two of these other anti-auto attack items won't be enough to deal with the enemy team. You can pick this up. Hey, post-editing Inter coming in here, just to mention the breastplate glyph, of course, is really good. Breastplate's insane right now, and while the determination glyph is usually what you want to go in most matchups, Breastplate of Vigilance is of course worth a mention here, as it does have a very strong anti-auto attack passive that got buffed recently. But moving on to the largest category of counter items in Smite, we have the anti-heal options. I'll start here by stating the obvious that I say every time I discuss anti-heal. The enemy team does not need to have a team healer like Hel, Afro, Ra, or Guan Yu for these anti-heal items to be worth a buy. They are the most widely applicable counter items in the entire game, as nearly every team comp you face has healing of some kind. Be that through strong lifesteal like a Devos on their ADC or Soul Eater on their jungler, or via strong self-sustain in kit with like Thanatos or Hercules, these anti-heal items are very well statted for the most part and often have a secondary passive in addition to their anti-heal, and are 100% worth a pickup even if you're just against a couple of strong lifestealers or self-sustainers. Think Anubis or Hades. Into specifics though, Pestilence and Contagion are the two main tank anti-heal options, and while they are great and you should build them if needed, they are typically a bit worse than the main damage dealer anti-heal options, which we'll talk about in a second. Which one of these you pick up mainly depends on what kind of defense you need in terms of physical versus magical in your build. Most solo laners will go for Contagion, as they will face a physical in their lane most of the time, so grabbing this makes sense, but Pestilence does offer a lot more overall anti-heal than its physical counterpart. So if you really need strong anti-heal desperately, Pestilence is better, whereas Contagion has more utility through its mana, MP5, and useful secondary passive that counters CC. Also worth noting that these auras don't stack with each other, so if you already have a Contagion, Pestilence will do nothing for you, unless it's a split backline and frontline situation like I mentioned earlier, where maybe your solo laner is auraing himself and his jungler, and your support is auraing themselves and their backliners. That can sometimes be applicable too, it's not necessarily terrible, but do be aware that these auras don't stack with each other. Moving on to the damage dealer anti-heal options though, Divine Ruin and to a lesser extent Brawler's Beatstick are the premium anti-heal options in Smite for the most part. They apply Antiheal on hit for 5 seconds and have a useful secondary passive as well. With Divine's version being completely insane, just giving free damage, basically an oboe proc every time you do this, and Brawlers being less good but still useful. These items apply 40% anti-heal instead of the 25% that Contagion and Pestilence apply, well, at base anyway. Pestilence can apply more than that when stacked up, but the enemy does have to damage you 6 separate times to reach max stacks on that Pestilence, and you have to make sure you stay within the aura range. Divine and Brawlers are just so quick and easy to apply and get online because they're flat pen for the early game and just overall efficient items. Divine is especially nutty because of its great passive and Mage's inherent ability to poke from range very effectively and keep Divine's passive on enemies for long periods of time, while not really risking their own life to do so. These two are the premium cream of the crop for anti-heal, and you should absolutely pick them up even into just strong self-sustain like Anubis, Hades or Herc, and it goes without saying you're trolling if you don't build these against a team healer. You barely lose any stats compared to other options, and if you could see the amount of healing reduced by these, you'd realize how strong they are in the right situation. Next up is Toxic Blade, which doesn't really have the same crazy value that Divine and Brawlers have for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's a 3-stack item, and while at max stacks it does give the single most anti-heal of any normal tier 3 item in the game, you need to basic attack someone 3 times to get that max value, which is not massively difficult, but is certainly harder than just throwing out a mage ability for poke and spreading anti-heal to everyone via Divine Ruin. The second reason this is less picked up is because there's no space for it in Hunter builds. For Hunters, every stat matters, since their main goal is just to shoot as much DPS through autos as fast as possible. Toxic Blade stats just aren't ideal, and skipping out on something like a Kin Size, Executioner, or Crit item for this just feels terrible and massively hurts your ADC's DPS in the late game. Whereas Brawlers and Divine are perfectly statted for ability users with flat pen and power, and you barely lose any damage for picking these up in the first place. That said, Toxic Blade might have some potential as an early game rush given it has 15 flat pen, and with Devourer's Gauntlet being basically the only item picked up by ADCs in first slot nowadays, the anti-heal passive actually does get good value when boxing in the laning phase. Same goes for an enemy Freya with Telkines, Ability Hunter with Soul Eater, all that kind of stuff, but overall, this is just an incredibly hard item to fit into your build, and generally, Divine, Brawlers, Contagion, and Pestilence fill the spot better. Since anti-heal now caps at 80%, Toxic Blade at full stacks already nullifies some value if at least one of these other items is active at the same time, and it's just not quite there as a premium option in my opinion. If the rest of your team are drooling noobs and aren't picking up anti-heal, sure you can probably grab this, but in general, you're better off with your mid and jungle having Divine or Brawlers, and your tanks having Contagion or Pestilence. Speaking of premium though, next up we have the Tainted Starter items. These are pretty much exclusively reserved for solo laners, since supports can't get them because they need the gold and sustain from a green starter, and you won't really see damage rolls picking these up over their main starter options. In solo though, these two items, specifically Tainted Breastplate, are extremely good and a little overlooked sometimes. Solo lane is the most sustain focused role, at least in the laning phase, and Tainted is going to get value in literally every matchup. They'll either have built-in sustain, go some lifesteal in their build, or HP 5 maybe, might even have a Chalice of Healing. Even against just a Chalice, they're healing 150 less and you're healing 180 for free over the course of 3 uses of that Chalice. Of course, I'm not saying go Tainted Steel every game just because they might go Chalice, but in matchups where the enemy might be self-sustaining via abilities, Soul Eater, HP 5, Chalice, whatever, this item is hella worth it. The upgrades are very well statted too for the late game, with plenty of power that helps you amping up your damage a little bit as a tank, and good defensive stats as well. Great starter option in many matchups in solo if you can stomach losing out on Bluestone, Death Toll, Sigil, whatever you might want for your god. And finally for the anti-heal options, we have the dedicated relic for this effect, Cursed Ankh. This applies 40% anti-heal for a massive 10 seconds, which can be most of a teamfight a lot of the time, while having added bonuses like anti-shielding and enemies taking increased damage if they heal under this effect. Both upgrades are nice, but I do lean more towards Blighted Ankh, as the miasma pulls from Drowned can often just be ignored and walked around in fights, while Blighted just makes enemies take 20% more damage, and shares the healing reduced by this relic with nearby allies. Ankh is of course exclusively a tank option, as squishies need Beads Aegis or Beads Blink, and often solo laners need some combination of Blink, TP, and Beads. So unfortunately, usually the responsibility of this relic lies with the support. I would personally say this item is mostly for a dedicated team healer like Afro or Guan though, since proccing the effect on just 1 or 2 guys self-sustaining through one ability is nice, but there are better relics you could be grabbing at that point. But if the enemy team specifically has a ton of ability-based self-sustain, then you could pick this up if you feel a standard tier 3 item anti-heal won't be enough. Moving on though, let's cover the sister of Antiheal, Antishield. A more recently introduced mechanic to Smite as more and more shields have been added over the years. There's less shielding than healing and therefore less anti-shield options, and I have to say, most of them aren't great, and I would only pick these up if there is a major shield problem on the enemy team, like a Yamoja with Shell and Fabless Hoops or something like that. But you can also grab these if you feel the base stats and or other effects are something you want, and the anti-shield effect is just ancillary. Firstly, Gem of Isolation is really not worth buying almost ever in my opinion. The base stats are horrible for the cost, and unless the enemy team has an immense amount of shielding capabilities, I don't think this item is worth picking up. A far cry from Divine Ruin's dominance in the sister category. Erosion, the tank option for anti-shield, is actually a better story though in my opinion. This item has decent base stats for the cost and a little extra bonus of movement speed whenever someone shields within your aura, which is massive, meaning you still get value even if there's only 1 or 2 shields on the enemy team. There is still a significant cost to picking this up though, as it has slightly worse base stats than the other Druid Stone Tree items, so if you are going to pick this up, you need quite a few shields on the enemy team to work off of, since you're foregoing a passive like Binding or Arc Druids for this anti-shield effect. But it can sometimes be worth it in specific matchups like the aforementioned Yamoja. Nike is a good one for this item as well, and I think it has some merit being picked up, unlike Gem of ISO. And the final main tier 3 anti-shield option is Envenomed Deathbringer, and this is probably the best of the 3, mainly because the base item is so good that you're building it in every crit build anyway, plus you get the anti-healing, which is way more valuable than anti-shielding. You already want this item, and it has 2 useful effects instead of 1, so the choice is pretty easy. Envenomed Deathbringer is the premium anti-shield if there ever was one. But finally, we do have 2 relics that apply anti-shield as well, which is Cursed Ankh that I mentioned before, and Sunder. Ankh is the same situation as Envenomed DB. You might already want it for something else like the anti-heal, and the anti-shield is just an added bonus against some teams. I wouldn't recommend picking up Ankh purely for anti-shield, as it's not really worth the relic slot when support or solo could have something more useful. In terms of Sunder, this item is similar in that the anti-shield is more secondary to its main effect of current health true damage and increased damage taken on the target. However, Sunder and Ankh work differently to the normal tier 3 items in terms of how they work with shields. The normal items apply a debuff that reduces future shield applications, whereas Sunder and Ankh actively destroy 75% of active shields on hit. This makes them more useful in certain counter matchups like Nike, Vamana, Odin, and a few others, where removing a large portion of their shield on command can be deadly. As general anti-shielding stuff against like Shell, Yamoja, etc., these relics aren't as useful, but in applications where one massive shield is cock-blocking your damage, these two, especially Sunder because of the damage increase, can be extremely useful. And finally, a few specific counter items that don't fall under any of the previously mentioned groups. Firstly, Winged Blade is an incredible item when it's useful. This effect makes all allies around you, including yourself, immune to slows and gives 20% movement speed for 4 seconds when hit by a slow. This can completely negate certain abilities or relics where a lot of their value comes from that slow. Horrific Emblem is a perfect, simple example of this. Enemy support or solo dives into your backline, forces your mid or ADC's movement ability, then hits them with this. If you're near them as the support, this 30-second internal cooldown effect just negated a 110-second relic. The same goes for large AoE ability slows like Cerberus 2, Cthulhu 2, Nike ult, stuff like that. This item is usually going to be on the support to prevent backliners from being slowed, but can still be picked up occasionally in certain matchups from solo. It's also super cheap at only 1850 gold, which is important for counter items as you don't need to delay your main build actual items by as much due to the cheap cost of Winged Blade. So that's a pretty glowing review from me, but I will mention that Winged Blade generally needs either one large AoE slow that is impacting most of your team on a regular basis in teamfights, or multiple smaller or single target slows that are strong. Since the item's base stats are pretty horrific compared to most other items, you really need that effect to be doing work to justify this pickup. But that happens in more situations than you'd think, so definitely consider Winged Blade if you keep dying to strong slows. Next up is Bloodforge, which I really don't know if I should include as a situational item, but I feel its effects being only on kill makes this thing not really a main build particularly. You have to be getting consistent kills in fights or this item is just worse statted for the cost than other options, but if you are getting consistently 1 or 2 kills per engagement, this thing can really help you snowball that advantage into full-on team wipes as you sweep through collecting several shields as you go. Not a specific counter item like everything else in this video, but still situational to a certain extent. The amount of people I've seen who are 2-7-1 and haven't got a kill in the last 10 minutes of gameplay but buy this item made me want to include it on the list. Next up is an extremely useful defensive item in Magi's Cloak, a classic of Smite that has been around forever, helping mostly squishies survive strong CC dive comps. The passive bubble this item gives protects from 1 hard CC and makes you CC immune for a brief time afterwards. You only get 1 set of beads, and they're on a 170 second cooldown for most of the game, only reaching 140 seconds when you upgrade them. Sometimes that's just not enough if you're getting caught out or dived in fights by gods with a CC that will kill you if they land it. Is it as good as beads? Hell no, but beads are so essential to squishies in Smite that sometimes having an extra worse set of them can be game changing. Buying this item on a squishy does have its downsides, of course. You lose out on an entire damage item you could have had, which is a huge loss, but if you are getting CC chained in every fight and your beads forced on cooldown, then you're probably not getting a chance to deal much damage anyway, and this item can be a lifesaver. If you're doing 20% less damage but surviving instead of dying and doing no damage, that's still hell of a worth pickup in my opinion. It also has glyphs now, which makes the bad stats of the item a little bit more manageable, as you can get an extra effect after your bubble is popped. I've talked about squishies for the most part so far, but this item can be useful on supports and solos as well. It's way less picked up there, but especially on vulnerable supports like Sylvanas or ones with no CC immunity on their ultimate, this item can be a lifesaver if you're being focused down and picked every fight by a strong CC like an Ares ult or Athena taunt or whatever. Next up is Stone of Gaia, which I personally don't think is really worth building much in its current state due to the lack of any protections or mitigations on the item. It has health, but anyone who knows Smite's internal mechanics will know that effective health is a much more important measure of tankiness, as protections will be mitigating well over half the damage you take before it even hits your health pool. That said though, this item's passive can be very good in certain matchups where an enemy is constantly applying displacement to you from their base kit like Hercules or Horus. Buying this just for an ultimate is definitely not worth it, as you really want to be proccing this passive on its 15-second internal cooldown to not lose out on value. The item is pretty bad all things considered, but that's the criteria you would be looking for to fit it in your build if you did want to, and it did just get buffed recently so you get some free power whenever that passive is procced. It could be a bit better now. And finally, a quick mention to Shogun's Kusari, which again, I didn't even know whether to include this as it's not that situational and isn't a counter item per se, but the 30% attack speed aura this provides is of course best used on teams with 2 auto attackers on them. Your ADC is almost always 1, so having something like a Kali in jungle, an Amaterasu in solo, a Hunter mid, etc., and this item instantly becomes worth a pickup. There are other situations where this is pretty much a main build, like on Ares or Fafnir in support, or auto attack solo laners like Bologna or Amma, which would build this item even if it wasn't an aura, as it's just one of the best magical defense attack speed options available to them. But other than that, I will be looking for at least 2 auto attackers on your team to justify picking this item up. But yeah, that's all I've got for every situational counter item in Smite explained and when to pick them up. I get a lot of questions about builds, and while they are hard to teach as they require micro decisions within each game to slot optimally, I thought I'd give some general pointers on when these counter items should be swapped into your build and when you don't really need them. Catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.